Welcome, Jenna. Great to have you here at the Frick. It's a real honor to have you as part of our Living Histories project. So we're meeting with all the artists from Living Histories, and we're asking a few questions and having a nice chat about your practice, about your work here at the Frick. And so maybe let's start with the big picture in a way. How do old masters inform what you do as an artist? And how does a place like the Frick, where is it placed in a way in your practice as an artist?
I think of painting as a language that I'm always trying to become kind of more fluent in. I kind of try to channel different eras of art history through different passages of paint. I think of it almost like having the ability to kind of time travel in a painting from one part of the image to another within a single painting. So I love coming to places like the Frick. I grew up not ever going to museums. I lived in a place where I didn't really have access to the history of painting in the flesh. So moving to New York was incredible for me because of the access to places like the Frick. I'm always just blown away by the way that paint was applied at different times throughout history. The moment that we're in and the way that we use information is really fast. For better or for worse, that painting with references across, the broad span of history feels more relevant to the way that we experience life in this time.
Yeah.
And it's a complicated history.
Absolutely.
There's a lot to talk about.
So it really struck me, you were saying that, in a way, museums became part of your life, in a way, when you moved to New York. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit about that journey to New York? Obviously, all the artists in Living Histories are working and living in New York City. Mm-hmm. So how was that transition for you?
Well, so I grew up in East Tennessee, and I always kind of dreamed of New York. A lot of the reason was some kind of notion that art existed here, and it didn't really exist around me where I grew up. So I left Tennessee, and then I went to college at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, which was isolated still from the world enough to just really be in my studio and really like learning how to paint. I feel like that's where I really developed my relationship to the materials. And then soon after graduating from undergraduate school, I moved to New York, and that was 2003.
It must have been so exciting just to sort of arrive here and suddenly, be exposed to all this art around you.
Yeah, exciting and overwhelming, because I think in New York you're dealing with institutions like this or the Metropolitan Museum that house, the entire history of art. And then there's also the contemporary art world, which is, happening all around you. And there's a steep learning curve for sure.
But that, I think, it's also like one of the most daunting and also the most fun aspects of it. Also as a curator, we're all like always learning new things as we go along, and the fact that we're all exposed to so much art and so much complication and so many challenges becomes something that I find very energizing in a way in a city like New York, that we are confronting these big issues and learning from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to look at our history and be critical of it, but maintain a connection to it, which is why it's so important that institutions like this one exist, I think.
So in Living Histories, you are responding, you are in conversation with Holbein, with the portrait of Thomas Cromwell. How was that for you? You're encountering this great artist from the past, and you're presenting your extraordinary work next to his work, produced in a very different time and produced for very different reasons. What is that relationship like?
Well, first of all, it was kind of mind-blowing to even consider the possibility of it, and really exciting. I love Holbein, the beautiful jewel-like quality of the surface and the fabrics and perfect depictions of things. One thing I feel about Holbein is that he has this way of painting everything with this kind of separateness, so that each object is self-contained in a way and holds its own discrete power, almost like each object is its own talisman. I was thinking not only about the relationship to Cromwell, but about sort of breaking up the former relationship that existed for so long between Sir Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell in the museum, and the idea of replacing Sir Thomas More and filling those shoes, I felt like I wanted to put something there that could maybe be as exciting. And that's kind of where the velvet entered in. Everyone is completely enamored with Sir Thomas More's velvet sleeves. So I was like, well, if they want velvet, I'll give them velvet. I'll give them all the velvet. And also my work is often concerned with camp and the camp aesthetic. And so I wanted to take the velvet and push it to an extreme. I think camp is such an important and beautiful and wonderful aspect of the queer aesthetic historically, because I think about camp kind of in the terms that Susan Sontag does in her notes on camp. She says that, you know, something like Swan Lake can be camp, you know. So to me, I look at the Frick collection and I see tons of camp, actually.
Holbein is camp.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly,
camp. Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
So, but I wanted to really play that up and enliven the experience of looking at old paintings, that maybe you can see them in this way that's slightly more fun.
I mean, having seen your work now in the galleries, you know, Frick was someone who was so interested in creating pendants. You know, he buys the Thomas More, and there is no Lady More, so he ends up buying his arch rival, his arch enemy, to match him with. And that room, usually at the Frick and also here at Frick Madison, has this incredible male power. It's these two men staring at each other, both painted by another man. And what I find really powerful now is that you have this man painted by a man matched with a woman, a very powerful woman, painted by another woman. How do you feel about that? I mean, it's a moment, I think, for the Frick that is a very important one.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of my main goals in making the painting, was to paint a woman with incredible presence and power and assertiveness, because it's something clearly lacking in the history of painting in this collection, as well as most collections. There aren't a lot of women who are self-possessed and empowered. From a kind of humor standpoint, I liked the idea of her really intimidating Cromwell. And I think she does.
She does,
I
absolutely.
think that worked
it works
out.
very well.
Yeah. And she, you know, in real life, she has this kind of very powerful presence, and I wanted to communicate that to the viewers. There are only a few depictions of women that could maybe be interpreted as potentially queer. You know, it's like very rare to have a depiction of a queer woman in a museum like this one. And also, yeah, there should be a sense of rivalry, you know, in terms of the relationship to Cromwell if she is the replacement for Sir Thomas More. So the rivalry is still alive in the room.
Absolutely, and I never imagined that Cromwell could look so weak next to anyone else. But and I think this tension, you know, to me, it's a very moving moment, because so much of the paintings at the Frick are about husbands and wives when it comes to portraiture, with historically the wife as almost an accessory to the husband. Or the portraits of incredibly beautiful women, again, painted by men, you know, under a very sort of male gaze of, you know, what these women mean and who they are, and sort of selected and interpreted in a number of different ways. But there's always been this gap. And in fact, you know, you're the first person to fill that gap of, you know, a great woman artist who is portraying another woman in this incredible, direct, intimate way also, but very powerful. There's so much electricity in that room right now. I think it's incredible.
Thank you so much. I was hoping that would be what happens.
And I hope the visitors, you know, really capture that as they walk into that space. I mean, there's, you know, the oxygen is sort of running out in a way as there is this, you know, interaction between these two amazing paintings.
It was really important for me to get her facial expression right also, because again, in the history of painting, there are all these placid women who are so demure and blushing, and she's the opposite of that. Her gaze is so direct, but also makes you feel intruded upon. And the title of the painting is, "What am I doing here? I should ask you the same." And it's sort of a reference to maybe questions you might have about her as a subject, and does she belong there? Does she have a right to be there? But then it's also about my own feelings about my right to be in the museum in this context. And I just think it's a really good opportunity to help viewers pause and think about the implications of what it means to be in a museum, to be a person who's able to exhibit in a museum, to be the subject of a painting in a museum. Who are the subjects that we have access to? What are the stories that we're used to being told? And if there's something different about this story, what is it and what does that mean? really just felt like an amazing opportunity to bring up some of those questions.
And they're such important questions. And I think the fact that just the encounter between two works that are sort of alien to each other in a way creates this discussion and creates these questions for the public, for anyone coming to the museum, for us working in the museum, for the artists out there. I think it's really, really important. One question we're asking all of the artists working in this project is, if you could have painted one of the works at the Frick, it's a very unfair question, but it's a fun question, what would have you liked to paint?
It's a very difficult question. There's so many paintings I love in this collection. But I think that for most of my life, I probably would have said one of the Vermeers, particularly Mistress and Maid. That painting is so beautiful, and I love the kind of ambiguous gesture, implied narrative between two women. I love Vermeer, and he's such a longtime hero of mine, but I think if I were actually thinking about painting something, I would want to be painting one of the Fragonards, the series, The Progress of Love. There's just such joy and pleasure in the process of painting those that you can see. They're just seductively candy-colored, where things are just sort of effortlessly laid down on the canvas without a lot of fussing around, you know? So they seem like the most fun paintings to make. I would have liked to have made that series. But gay.
But,
yeah.
you know, in a sort of, yeah, I agree. But also, you know, it took me a long time to get around to those paintings. And now I absolutely love them. And what struck me the more I kept thinking about them is the fact that, you know, of course, they're painted for a woman, for a very powerful woman, for the lover of the king. And they're about heterosexual relationship. I mean, they're men and women. But it's about the women, it's not about the men.
Yeah.
So the men come as the accessory to the main woman in each panel.
Yes.
And that is such an interesting way to think about it for something painted in the 18th century and the way we can look at that today. But I agree, you know, the gay version of that would be amazing.
Yeah. And there's something about his paintings, the women are always kind of in their pleasure. The women are really expressing joy and pleasure in a way that's pretty rare, I think, throughout the history of painting. They're not actually so shy and demure. It's like when their cheeks are blushing, it's excitement, it's not shame, I think. That's my interpretation.
No,
anyway.
I love that. I love that idea. And so what's next for you after Living Histories? What are you working on? What are your next projects?
Well, I have an institutional exhibition coming up in the fall that hasn't been announced yet.
Okay,
it's in Europe. Soon after that, the next show will be in Hong Kong with Massimo De Carlo.
Fantastic. Look forward to seeing the shows.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for participating in this project. I think this encounter between these two works, I hope, will create a lot of questions for our public, for all of us who are lucky enough to see these wonderful paintings together. So thank you so much for that. And I invite everyone to join us and come and see the painting all the way through May of this year.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been just an incredible experience.